If you clicked on this video, there's a non-zero chance you're a weeb. And I'm here to tell you that because of that, you have something in common with him. That's right. You both know Portuguese, or at least a few words of Portuguese. And this is because Japanese has a lot of Portuguese and a tiny bit of Spanish. But why is this? How is it possible that two countries on opposite sides of the globe almost have linguistic influence over each other? The answer lies in history, specifically the history of Portuguese exploration. Now, as many of us know, in the early modern period, the Portuguese tried to establish a maritime trade route with Asia. And by 1500, Portugal had already established regular contact with India. It was only a matter of time after that that they were going to establish contact with Japan. Now, there are other channels that have covered this history in more depth, and I'm going to link them in the description below in case you want to go into this a bit deeper, but for our purposes, I'll summarize the history briefly. In 1543, the Portuguese missionary and explorer Fernão Mendes Pinto claimed to have been the first Portuguese to arrive on the island of Japan when the Chinese junk him and his colleagues were sailing on was blown adrift to the island of Japan. Now, of course, many historians since have questioned how accurate Mendes Pinto's account is, and most posit that there were Portuguese explorers who had already established contact with Japan about at least a year prior to 1543. Either way, from the 1550s onward, we see the beginning of what is called the Nanban period of trade and exchange between Portugal and Japan. And it wasn't just commercial interchange that was going on. The Portuguese were also engaged in a missionary enterprise. And for that reason, we see a number of Christian concepts that were introduced into Japanese with Portuguese vocabulary. Now, a lot of the theological religious vocabulary that comes into Japanese from Portuguese has been replaced by more native Japanese words recently. But in the early modern period, in the 1500s and 1600s, the Portuguese word anjo was taken into Japanese as anjo and meant angel, the Christian concept of an angel being denoted here. Another interesting example of this, and one of my favorite, is bateren, which in early modern Japanese meant Jesuit priest and seems to come from the Portuguese padre, meaning father. Now, both of those have modern Japanese equivalents, tenshi and senkyoshi. But what's particularly interesting about the plethora of Japanese loanwords from Portuguese is that because of the time that they were adopted into the Japanese language, they may conserve phonetic and semantic features that have disappeared in modern Portuguese altogether. And two culinary words might be an excellent example of this. The Japanese word for bread is pan, which comes from the Portuguese pão. Now, the fact that the Japanese has the nasalized consonant n in their version of the word might indicate that the complete nasalization of the vowel that we see today wasn't there in early modern Portuguese. There are some studies that seem to maintain this. So the Japanese version of the word may reflect more than the modern Portuguese version of the word how Portuguese were saying bread in the 15 and 1600s. Another example of this is a word that would be familiar to sushi enjoyers, tempura, which comes from a 15th century Portuguese word meaning seasoning. And this one is super interesting because there's some evidence that the Portuguese tempura, which was adopted by the Japanese as we see here, might actually come from the Latin expression quator tempora, which essentially meant a time of fasting that would occur 4 times during the year, during which only seafood would be eaten. That certainly would explain why we associate it today with Japanese seafood. The Japanese word for glass, bidoro, comes from the Portuguese vidro, and actually might reflect the fact that in early modern Portuguese, that O ending hadn't yet become pronounced as U, and was pronounced in a more open O sound, which is conserved in the Japanese word. Now, some of this vocabulary is pretty straightforward and refers to places. For example, the Japanese word for Holland is oranda, which comes directly from the Portuguese word oranda. The Japanese word for the United Kingdom, igurisu, seems to come from the early modern Portuguese inglês, meaning English. And what about that tiny bit of Spanish that might be in modern Japanese that I mentioned earlier on? Well, the Japanese word for soap is shabon. And that linguists theorize, comes from the Spanish word for soap, which was also shabon or jabon, depending on how early modern Spaniards might have pronounced the X symbol. There is some evidence that in some parts it was pronounced sh and in some parts it was pronounced ch. So, for example, early modern Spaniards might either say Don Quixote or Don Quixote, but that's a topic for another video. Now, this video is by no means exhaustive. You can find on Wikipedia a whole list of vocabulary in Japanese that comes from Portuguese if you want to look into this a bit more. But I'd also like to finish off by asking you a question. Do you know of any Japanese words that come from Portuguese or Spanish? I'd also be interested in Japanese words from Italian or French. And I'd like to also clarify, I have very little idea of how Japanese should sound, so if I've made any mistakes, I apologize for that. Let me know in the comments below about that. But if you have any other really interesting instances of this, let me know in the comments below. But before I leave you, this story has a fascinating epilogue, including the history of the production of the first Japanese dictionary for foreign language speakers, and also how a lot of Japanese vocabulary is now entering Portuguese and has been doing so since the 20th century in Brazil. So stick around because that's going to be a topic of a follow-up video. I'll see you then.